All right, so today our focus may be on something that is like some of the syntax for advanced routing might be familiar or you may have seen it before. So really the focus today is less on new information and new material and more on the process of viewing our routes file and working with it and deciding what to add to it and why, kind of those like design choices that come along with building a routes file in a Rails app. So yeah, that's just a little bit of context for what we're going to get into today. The first thing we'll do is take some individual work time. We'll probably take about 5 minutes to work through these 2 bullet points on the activity you see on the screen. The first is going to be to pick a resource. So the example we have here is dogs, and write down in a doc or your journal or something like that what the 7 RESTful routes for that resource that you pick would be. You can pick something other than dogs if you'd like. And try to do this from memory if you can. Try to remember what these routes would look like in your routes file. The 7 RESTful routes that we talked about a couple of classes ago. And if you need to look it up, that's fine, but see how many you can get first without looking up the documentation or the notes from the other class. And also consider for each of those routes, which Rails controller and which controller action does it map to. The second thing will be to look at this model setup on the right on the screen and write down what the RESTful route would be to create a book for a particular author. And there's a little hint there in case you get stuck getting started on that. So feel free to turn off your camera while you work, and we'll take about 5 or 6 minutes to work through this before coming back together. Okay, let's go ahead and come back together. And I'm just going to call on a few people to share what you noted down, and you can share or bump to a friend. So let's see. Ryan, could you share one of those routes you came up with?
So one of the 7.
Mm-hmm.
So the first one I wrote was index.
Okay. So in our routes file, how would we set that up?
So for dogs, I think it would be it would be a get verb, and then it would be \dogs for the, I guess is that called the path, and then the 2 would be dogs with a hash symbol, and then index.
Awesome. And thank you. And then this would, could you call out which, like you said, index, and then it's going to which controller?
This would go to the dogs controller.
Right. Awesome. Thank you. I'll go ahead and call on somebody else. And if you didn't use dogs as your example, that's okay. I can note down whatever you had, and we'll talk about it. So could we get another one? Dougie? Do we have Dougie? Looks like maybe Dougie isn't here. I think that's right. Let me call on someone else. Logan, do you have another one that we could add to this?
If order doesn't matter or anything, I think so.
Sure. Let's see what you got.
You would do get, and then it would be /dogs /:ID, and then it would you close that off and then do a comma, and then 2, and the controller would be dogs, and the action would be show.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. Looks good to me. Yeah, and order doesn't matter in these. I'm just hoping to get all of the 7 RESTful ones that we have talked about before. See. Alexander, could you share another one of these or phone a friend? Alexander? Yeah.
Yeah. Do get /dogs /new to dogs new.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, let's see. We hear from Brisa.
Yeah, so we have show new. Let's go ahead and do edit. So it'll be a get, and then it'll be a \dogs /:ID/edit.
Okay.
And the controller will be dogs action edit.
Or edit action.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. All right, could I hear from Joe Mecca?
Sure, let's do patch next.
Okay.
And that's going to be dogs /ID. And then it's going to be dogs update.
Awesome, thank you. Looks like I missed a colon on this one. All right, just a couple more. Could I hear from Andrew Schaefer? Oops.
All right, so let's see, what do we have? Okay. Unfortunately, I think these are all the ones that I can remember.
No worries. Do you want to just take a guess at one or bump to a classmate?
Let's see. Delete.
Okay.
That's delete. And then it would be dogs ID delete. Yeah, two dogs hash
Dogs.
and then delete.
Oh, okay. I think I see what you were saying. My bad. So I think you were saying.
Yeah, that's the more proper way to do it.
Okay.
I think.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that. I don't think I would necessarily expect to see anything after that dog's ID. One thing I will add here is that it's more conventional, and this is, I think, Andrew,
Destroy?
good memory, but yeah, it's destroy. I think one of the easiest things to mix up is the verb delete with the controller action or the CRUD action destroy. That's great though, thank you. Let's see, I think we have what, 6 now, so a couple more. Austin, do you have another RESTful route we could add to this?
Yeah, I think the last one is update.
Okay.
So,
Or
I think it's patch, the verb.
we do have patch to dogs update.
Oh, my bad.
No worries.
Is it create?
I don't think we have create yet. Cool. How would we do that?
So create is, I think the verb is post.
Yep. Awesome.
And then I think it's dogs/ID to dogs #create. And this will be the dogs controller.
Cool. Yep. Thank you. The only thing I have to add to that or change a little bit is that typically, I think what's conventional, I think we've seen this, would be to not include an ID. We're just adding to the way I think of this is we're just adding something to the list of dogs.
Okay.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. That was great. I will take a volunteer to talk about what would be a RESTful route to create a book for an author given the setup on this slide. Anyone want to raise their hand and take a stab at that? Joe?
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is right, but I'll take a stab at it.
Okay, let's try it.
Would it be post and then in quotes authors / colon author ID or underscore ID? Yeah.
Yeah.
And then / books into quotes comma 2 colon and then just the books pound create. Oh, and it looks like I missed a / at the beginning of the author's URI.
May have been me. That looks great to me. Could you talk a little bit more about how you got to this solution? Like, why would we do it this way?
Yeah, so because it's a parent-child relationship, and due to that relationship, you have to go through the parent first, is the way I thought of it, which is why you're kind of starting with the authors. But then you want a specific, author to attach that book that you're creating it to, which is why you're going to do the colon author underscore ID. And then you still need to specify that it's going to be within the books. Yeah, sorry, that's probably the best explanation.
No, that's great. Thank you. You got it.
Yeah, and then obviously it has to take place, as far as I know, within the books controller. Now, if the relationship was different, I'm sure it might take place in a different controller, maybe. I'm not really sure on that, but yeah, that's what I got.
Yeah, totally. Thank you. Thank you, Joe. That's great. And I'll expand a little bit on what you said, if that's okay, before we move on. Just going back here to look at the relationship between these two, like you said, Joe, this is a one-to-many relationship that we have an author that has many books, and then a book has to belong to an author. So whenever we create a book, like this hint says, you should have author ID somewhere in the route. We need to know which author to associate that new book record to, right? And you said something along the lines that it has to go to the books controller. I'd say that's the RESTful and conventional way that I would create this route, would be to map this to the books controller. It could be done another way, right? You could map this to the dogs controller if you wanted, but it wouldn't be conventional or RESTful, right? So yeah, I think that's where we'll leave off there. This is, like I mentioned earlier in class, stuff that's all probably pretty familiar at this point. But as we go deeper into how the routes file works and some syntactic sugar and shortcuts that Rails gives us, this is really good base foundational knowledge to keep in mind. Does anybody have questions before we move on? Ryan?
Yeah, just a quick question. So if on this same one we just did, if there was a route to a form to fill in the book's information, would it be get authors with the ID book and then books / new? Or would it just be books / new for the route?
I think that could depend upon how you have it set up, but let me see if let me make sure I heard your options right there. So the first one being get authors / author ID / books new. And then that would map to like probably the books controller new, just like we had for the create. I think this is how I would this is how I would set up a route for a new form for a nested resource. I think there are probably other ways to include your author ID into that new form, but this is RESTful because it indicates to whoever is viewing the routes file, like we have authors and then we have a specific author and then we have books, and we can kind of, as Rails developers and just developers generally familiar with REST, get the information from that we need. We can understand that, yeah, this book has to belong to an author because I can just see that in the route. So that answer your question, Ryan?
Yes.
Cool, no problem. Any other questions before we move on? Okay. And we will, I think we have time to move on and look at the next slide before we take a pause. Cool. So this is a tool that I want to share with everybody in case you haven't used it before. This is a tool for basically seeing the end result of the code in your routes file. So very quickly from the console, you can run Rails routes and it will show you all of the routes, which I'll demonstrate here in a second. And you can denote from that what you already have available, what controllers they're mapping to, and what the prefixes are, which we'll get into later in the lesson. So this is just a really, really good tool to be using for debugging, for setting up your routes file. And absolutely, it's a good tool to use in the exercises that we'll be doing as part of class today. So that's why we're covering it now. This will show the verb path and the controller with the controller action, as well as the prefix. More on that later. And then you can also give it the flag of -C with a controller name to just return you the routes that have to do with a certain controller. So let me actually exit out of this and do a couple of these. So the other thing I'll mention is you might see this written as Rake Routes, which I think we even discussed it, Brian discussed it in the project kickoff, that Rake is synonymous with Rails in these types of contexts. So we're going to use the syntax Rails routes. And if I just enter Rails routes like this, it will show me all the routes that I have in my routes file. So right now I just have set list open. These are all of our hand rolled routes, just like you did, just like we've been talking about up to this point. And here's the output that I get. So like I just mentioned, we have the prefix here, and we'll talk more about what this is used for later. Some of you may have already be familiar with some of the syntax. We have our HTTP verb. We have the URI pattern or the path. And then in our fourth column over here, we have the controller and the action. So this is showing us everything we have. And if I wanted to get rid of some of these things that automatically come with Rails, for instance, like this active storage stuff, I could use our handy dandy Rails routes and the -C flag and say artist. And that will return all of the routes that I have set up for the artist controller. This is also, this will work with partial searches. So I could say something like Rails routes, C art, and it should still return me the same thing. So that is the basics of how you would use Rails routes. In general, yeah, it's a good way to learn. A good way to learn about something new in code is to try it, just experiment with it and see the effects. So we could just add some code to our routes file and see what changes. Let's see. So some of the other stuff that we'll be looking at is like a resources syntax. And I think I'll do just like maybe the first one from that. So I can do resources, dogs only maybe I'll do only index. And then I can come over here and say, I predict that that's going to return to me one route, and it'll be the index. It'll be for the controller action index and all that stuff. And I'll run Rails routes to just kind of see what changed. And then I get what I predicted. I have a get /dogs to the dogs index controller. So as you're working through this exercise, I think you can definitely just take any Rails app that you have handy and comment out the routes that you have and just work through this in any routes file. It doesn't matter which application. We shouldn't be doing anything that would require us to change stuff in controllers or models or anything like that. We're just going to be poking around at the routes file today. So any application that you have available that has a routes file, you can use that for the activity that I'm about to share with you all. Let me think here if I forgot anything. I think this would be a good place to take a pause before we kick off the next activity. So let's come back at 2:29. Okay, as people are coming back from that palm, if you could either have your video on or give me like an emoji so that I know who's back. Be super helpful. Cool. All right. Looks like I've got almost everybody. So if you take a look at the screen that I'm sharing, this is our next activity. It's kind of in that same spirit of trying things out and seeing what changes. This code is cheap and you can easily like add some and remove some to any of your Rails projects and should be totally okay. So really the idea here is to use the routes.rb file and the Rails routes command in your terminal to explore what each of the following will do. So what I'm going to do is send people into breakout rooms, and everybody should be exploring this and trying things out, and you should discuss with your small group what you're seeing and noticing. And then we'll come back after about 20 minutes and talk about it together. Any questions before I open up those breakout rooms? Okay, then I'm going to open these up and see you in about 20 minutes.
Hey, Jameson.
Hi, y'all. How's it going?
It's going pretty good. We're just looking at the scope and module stuff.
Cool. Yeah. So giving y'all like 5-8 more minutes to explore like the scope and module stuff would that be a good amount of time?
Yeah.
Cool.
Thank you.
No problem.
Yeah, I think that we've only been using patch, and the drift that I've been getting is like we don't really need to concern too much with put, and that like
yeah, it seems like put's more like a bigger update, like a bigger overhaul or something. Patch is like a smaller add-on.
right. I get the idea that put replaces everything, but a patch is if you want to change like one column or something.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
My idea of where I could think that a put's applicable is if you wanted to like not, I mean, I guess if like a website went down, the whole entire thing would be down, but if you just wanted like every single resource to be unavailable. But yeah, we haven't seen a use case for it yet.
I was confused on namespace, but you sent us that page, so that's helpful.
Yeah, namespace is the best.
Hi,
Yeah.
Jameson. You've entered probably the quietest room.
No worries. Can I ask about how far along y'all are in this activity to make sure I give you a good amount of time?
I
I'm
think most
the
of us are all the way
namespace part.
through.
Yeah.
Okay, cool, cool, cool. All right, well then I'll close these out pretty soon. See you then.
I'm not sure about
No
that.
worries.
Hi there. We're currently just all looking on our separate terminals.
That's fine. About where in the activity have y'all gotten to?
The module part, and I'm not.
Yeah, and I
100% sure.
jumped straight to that last box with the scope in, because like, yeah, I've used the others before, but I don't know what scope does at all.
Cool. Yeah, I would say that the scope and scope module, those are like nice to knows, and the documentation lays out like a few good examples, but cool. I just wanted to make sure I gave everybody a good amount of time. I'll probably close these out in a couple minutes.
Okay, sounds good.
Sweet.
Thanks.
Thanks,
Thank
y'all.
you.
It's about. Because the first one looks like it just bundles a bunch of what's it called, routes together so that you can do it in one line, but this one feels a bit more confusing.
Yeah, and I think a key part of the first one is it only made routes for the ones in the only bracket. If you didn't use only, it would just create all 7 for dogs.
Oh, okay.
All right, welcome back, everybody. I did ask you all to build in a POM, so hopefully most of you got to do that, but I'm going to start at 2:50 just to give everybody a chance to definitely be here. Okay, so I'd like to hear from some volunteers, I think. For this first one, does anybody want to share what they noticed or observed about the resources, :dogs, comma only syntax? Take a volunteer. What does that give us? Olivia?
Only going to show us the routes that are show, update, and destroy that have that after the hash, the pound.
Yep, exactly. So this would be very similar to hand rolling those 3 routes, right? I guess this is probably a good place to point out kind of the difference here. Or yeah, so if we were to do something like, if we were to do resources dogs and not pass it the only, we would get way more routes than we need potentially. Maybe we only need the index in the show, for example. So like you said, Olivia, giving it that argument will only return the routes that we specify. Cool, thank you. Could I get another volunteer to talk about this nested resources syntax and what's the difference there? What does that provide for us? Okay, Ryan?
Yeah, I would say that it gives us the 7 routes for both dogs and owners, but it seems like the only path that we have for the dogs controller is through the owners. If that makes sense.
Yep, it does, exactly. And I might even add to that and say it gives us the ability to create, it gives us nested routes for those resources that are inside the resources do end block, right? So in order to access those routes, we really do have to consider the parent and include the parent ID in the route, right? Cool, thank you. Did you have like a question or something to add on to that, Ryan? I saw your hand go back up.
No, that must have been a mistake.
Oh, no worries. Just wanted to double check. Thank you. Cool. Did anybody try out the namespace dog trainers with the resources dogs nested inside of that? Could anybody share? Claudia?
Yeah, it seems very similar to the one before with the nested dogs route in owners, except for this seems to make like in the like controller actions, it takes like dog trainers first and then like goes to the dogs controller. So it seems like it makes like the dogs inside of dog trainers, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. And then a follow-up question for you there, Claudia. When you ran Rails routes, did you get all the routes for dog trainers as well as dogs? Like, did it create routes for both of those resources, we could call them?
It looks like it just made them for dog trainers. So or maybe it just made them for dogs. No, it looks like it just.
If you have it handy, would you mind sharing your screen?
Yeah, I can
This is an interesting one to look at. No worries.
You can't share.
Sorry, it would help if I stopped sharing. There we go. How about now?
So right here, this is me running like the last one, and then this is the one that we're talking about right now.
Okay, cool.
So, I mean, it seems like it just does dog trainers here.
Interesting. Yeah, so what what we're seeing is a lot of the dog trainer syntax, right? To your point, like if we look in the prefix column, we have dog trainers dogs, new dog trainers dog. And then we also see this in our path, right? Like we have, I guess I should probably annotate what I'm talking about. Like we see it here in our prefixes, we see it in our URI pattern, but then when we get to the controller, I think I see somebody saying in chat, yeah, we have, I would describe this as a namespace controller, right? We have, this is implying that we have a folder in our file structure, and then the actual controller is for dogs. So with the resources syntax, we would expect to see like double the amount of resources, right? And we, in addition to having paths that map to the dogs controller, if we said resources dog trainers do, and then nested resources dogs in that block, we would see also routes mapping to the dog trainers controller, right? Claudia, if you could keep this up. I think Joe had a question first, or so we'll hear from Joe real quick.
Yeah, sorry. So then does dog trainers inherit from dogs then, or sorry, how does that work?
Right, so that's kind of what I was hoping to get at here, and by having Claudia share her screen so we could talk through this. When we're using namespace, and in this example, we use namespace dog trainers, and then we put resources inside that block. We actually are not creating a nested route that has anything to do with a relationship in our database. So dog trainers does not have to be a model, and this does not represent any kind of one-to-many or many-to-many relationship. Does anybody have an idea of why namespace might be useful? Like why would we use this syntax, and especially if this isn't denoting any particular relationship? Does someone have an idea, or have you seen this namespace syntax in the routes file before? Aiden?
I played around with this a little bit for the last project for admin, because I needed an admin index for applications. So I could take all of my admin controllers and put them into an admin folder. And this like namespacing routes things allows you to use those folders.
Yeah, great example. Thank you, Aiden. I would describe this syntax as being very useful for like organizing your file structure and organizing groups of related routes together. So like Aiden's example, and I think a few people may have done this on their last project, we could use the namespace syntax to create an admin folder to group all of our dog related routes in, or a dog trainers folder to group all of our dog related routes in. Okay, Claudia, thank you for sharing. You can stop now if you'd like. So we could really customize our behavior that way if we had, say, a namespace block with resources dogs inside of it, and then we said, okay, only dog trainers can create or destroy dogs. We could put our resources inside of that block with those actions specified. And then maybe outside of that namespace block, any user can see the dog's index. So we could just say resources dogs only index. So the namespace is more in line with organizing routes and grouping them together in ways that make sense. And the admin example, I think, is a very common pattern for this type of routing organization, and I think probably become more immediately useful as you continue on into mod 3, since we don't really do a lot of, we don't go into authorization in mod 2. That might be a more common thing to see and utilize in mod 3 when authorization is something to consider, like, oh, only admins should be able to access these actions, etc. Okay, I'm going to share my screen again. Before we move on, did any questions come up out of that activity that we haven't addressed? And just to throw this out there, because I don't think I did earlier, these, if you have time, explore, scope, module, and scope. I would describe these as more of like nice to have or nice to know little pieces. The documentation provides some like more detailed examples about these right under where it discusses namespaces, but we probably won't spend a lot of time talking about these today. These are more just, for your information, they exist. Yeah, if there are no questions, I do have like a little slide here on namespacing to talk about it in more detail. So this is a route helper that adds, that's one thing I think we didn't mention when Claudia was sharing her screen. This will also add a prefix to the route, and we'll talk about prefixes here in a second. And it creates that nested folder structure for our controllers. So this would be kind of the example that I would have in mind. This would expect a controller to live in app controllers, dog trainers, and then dogs controller would be inside that file or inside that folder, excuse me. And then another important thing to note about using this namespace syntax is that the controller class is defined differently. With this syntax, the namespace shows up here with these 2 colons. This indicates a namespace. So your controller would have this, this first piece that was added in the namespace part of the route, and then it would have these 2 colons to indicate that there's a namespace to the controller file itself. Just some syntax to keep in mind there. Okay, I'll stop annotating. So these are really useful for grouping these similar routes. Admin controllers could ensure that like the admin is logged in before executing that code. And like I said, this will come into play more in future mods. Cool. So if there's no more questions about the resources syntax and namespace and all that stuff that you are experimenting with, then we'll move on to path helpers. And this is where we get into the idea of the prefix, that first column that we see when we run Rails routes. We can use this prefix to generate paths, and this allows us to add an underscore path to the prefix in our code, and this will call the path helper method. So now instead of calling like writing out the whole string of the path that you mean to call, now we can use these helpers that Rails gives us for just easier and more reusable syntax. Some of these path helpers will need additional information, and usually that's an ID. So anytime that you would need to write out a route manually and wrap it in double quotes and interpolate an ID, that's the same route that as a path helper will need you to give it some additional information, and we'll pass these as arguments. An example of this might look like an ERB tag that's a link to, and then you have the text that you want that link to say. And then the second piece is the prefix dog, and then adding underscore path to that prefix and passing it an argument of a dog object. Rails is smart enough to infer that when you pass a path helper record, like at dog, a whole dog object, Rails will know to grab the ID from that and put it in the path for you. So you can see how this would be a lot more readable and probably just easier in general to code with than typing out your exact URI every single time. So this might look like, what's the easiest way to show this? Go ahead, Jody, do you have a question?
Yeah, can you use the path helpers, outside of just the views files? Like, could you use it in the controller as like maybe a redirect link or is it just views?
No, a good question. And absolutely, you can use them anywhere. You can use them to redirect in the controller. You can use them in poros, which we haven't talked about yet, but like anywhere in your Rails project, these will be available to you.
Thank you.
Tests as well. Sure. So I do want to, let me think about this for a second. I do want to show kind of an example of how we might use this syntax. And I think I'm just going to put like a binding.pry here in my artist index. I might need to bundle or something, so bear with me. No, looks like we're okay here. I'm going to go to local host artists and hit my, oh, I don't have a route for that. So let's go fix that. Let's say I have, let's just do resources artists for the time being. And now we're here in our binding.pry. So I could say something like artist's path, and it will return the string of the path that we're expecting. So let's say I open up a new tab and I want to see what routes I have available. I can run Rails routes. and I want to show a particular artist. So I can look at my prefixes that are available here in the first column and find, okay, artist get, and I know that this is going to go to the artist show controller. If I wanted to call that path from here inside of the index, I can do that like from my pry session, and I can say artist singular. And if I do this artist singular path and I don't pass it anything, it'll give me an error. It'll say no route matches, action show, controller artist, missing required keys, ID. So this is where we would need to pass it an argument to let it know, hey, go to this artist. So that would look something like this. And I'm just going to grab the first artist. This would normally probably be an instance variable or some other kind of variable you have access to, but for the sake of the example, that is going to say artist path, that is going to return /artist/1. To put it another way, I could also kind of hard code this. I could put in 50 and just calling that artist_path and passing it 50 will return /artist/50 as a string. So that's a little bit about how we would expect to use the prefix column. Okay, so that is all the content that I have to share with you today, other than like some takeaways that we might come back to at the end. But I wanted to open it up for any questions that came up during all of the class today about these routing tools that we have. Does anybody have anything they'd like to go over? And I guess, let's see. Could I get a 0 to 5 or a fist to 5 if you have your camera on, like 0 being, I think I'd rather just hand roll my routes, and 5 being, I'm ready to go implement this on my project right now. Awesome. Okay, cool. I like the ta-da emoji is like I'm assuming that's closer to a 5, George. Cool, thank you all. I think, let's see, let's go over this takeaway slide real quick here. And then if that's the case for a lot of you, I think what I'll do is leave this Zoom room open. I'll leave this call open until 3:30. And after this last slide, I'll send people off to go work on this on their projects. And I will be here to answer any questions that come up or go through any debugging that is related to your routes. So let me just make sure I hit these last few points that I want to be takeaways for y'all. So these are the big things to remember. All routes map an incoming HTTP verb and path combination to a controller and an action. Controllers can be nested in folders, and this is useful if you have a group of routes and controller actions that make logical sense together in a case such as authorization. All route helpers are shortcuts for creating the hand-rolled route. This is why in the first project, we really wanted everybody to go through that process of thinking through the verb path combinations and the controller action combinations so that when we introduced the syntax, there was a good foundation for making those design decisions. So there's the resources syntax, a resources block, the namespace, which can also be a block, path helpers, and a few other things that we didn't cover explicitly today. But these are the ones that I would say are most important to be familiar with at this stage in the mod. And really, like, if you walk away from today's class and there's a lot of advanced routing concepts that you don't understand, that's great, that's fine. But in being able to interpret Rails routes is very key to understanding routing and understanding the routing decisions that maybe other people made in the project or that you are making as you build out a new feature. So I believe that is it. I will stop sharing. And yeah, I think we have a good 20 minutes left. So if you would just take that time and see if there are any places where there's opportunity in your project to think about these routing decisions and how you want to design them. If you're to a point where you can go ahead and start writing code, this would be a great time to just start doing that. Otherwise, can go on into work time, but I will keep the Zoom room open until 3:30. Last thing would be if you could just, whenever you get a chance, give us some feedback on the survey that's linked in the calendar event. We really appreciate that. But yeah, that's all I have. I'll be here until 3:30. Thank you, everybody. Yes, Ryan?
Yeah, I thought I'd just sneak in one more question before I head out about the routes. They are accessed when you put in like for example, owner's path is gonna go to the routes file, and then that's gonna decide which action to go. Whereas if you have like let's say an update method in a controller, and you put if you put redirect to owner path with an argument, then that is going to go to the routes file and redirect that way. But if you put render, are you able to put render with a route in it, or is render only going to go to another action within the same controller?
Interesting. Okay, so I want to take that apart and make sure I'm understanding your question, because I might maybe hear a couple of things in there. So the first one is like kind of the difference between using redirect and giving it a path helper versus calling render, right? Redirect versus render. So the way that I think about it is that redirect has to do with routing, and is basically telling your application, hey, you are here now, go somewhere else, go to this address, basically. And a render is more like, okay, we're going to stop at this point in the action and we're going to render this view. So I'm just going to grab a view and give it to the user at this point. So when I use render, I'm typically calling the name of the action in the same controller, but it could be from a different controller, and you would just give it a path, a relative path. I think usually it would be like the name of the views directory, and then the name of the view file minus the extension. So you can render any view that exists basically at any point, and you can redirect to any route that exists at any point. And the reasons for doing either of those kind of depend upon the project. Does that start to answer your question, or do you have any follow-up?
No, it definitely does. I'm just, it's similar to that question that I had posted to you and Brian, and just that idea, if in our project we start getting to a method like update, who has a lot of like potential other updates that may happen as a result of one single update, meaning like maybe if someone says, okay, I've checked out, now change this invoice to this status and then delete something else. It's like, okay, one thing happening is leading to other things happening. I'm starting to think now that the best way to do that is to call a helper method from the update method within the same controller. So like if you had an invoices controller and you were routed to that controller to the update, and it said, okay, the invoice is closed. And then underneath that, you had another method called update line item. Then that method would also be in the same controller, and that update method may do some other thing that's located in the model. And that's how you would access that update feature. Does that make sense?
Yeah, just from listening and not seeing, from what I can tell, that all makes sense. And I would, the only thing I would add is that you could potentially call a helper method from a model from within your controller action. So maybe you have, like, I don't know, if you have like an invoice items, if you're in an invoice items update, then maybe you could call item dot toggle availability, and you could call that from that action. I think that would be better than calling multiple redirects in a controller. It'd be better to just kind of have a list of things that you go through before your final redirect that you actually want the user to experience. Yeah, I think that that's all on the right track. Helper methods, helper methods would be like probably the first thing I would do to refactor there.
Right. And the basic thing that I'm feeling is okay to do now is just because you're in like an invoices controller or a line items controller, it's okay to call methods from the other person's model essentially, right? Because you're like, okay, it may not be the invoices model that I'm using, but because I'm referring to invoices, it's okay to call that helper method outside of the class.
Yeah, exactly. Your models are available anywhere. So if you're in an invoice items update, for instance, you could call invoice dot whatever, and it would be able to do that. And you might have good reasons for doing that. If there's like some related functionality that needs to run with that invoice items update, that's perfectly okay.
Right on. Okay, thank you.
No problem.